Salvatore Babones, thanks a lot for speaking to CNN News 18. I look forward to another conversation with you on another aspect of politics, not just based in India, but overseas, but one that affects India and how India is perceived, or how people in India and overseas are perceived. You've come out with another paper of yours, and this one is titled "The Weaponization of Caste in America." This is coming at a time when we see a lot of caste-based activism, especially in American cities. Now, the title in itself is telling us a little bit about what you found. So, I want to begin by asking you, why are you terming this weaponization of caste in America and not say, how is it different from actual real activism?
It's the weaponization of caste because we have no real evidence of caste-based discrimination in the United States. Of course, there's a history of caste-based discrimination in India, and I think that's what a lot of people are counting on in these American caste wars. But the effort to identify the Hindu religion in particular with caste-based oppression is something that is being done in the United States with an obvious intention to discredit Hindus and discredit India more broadly, not something that's actually trying to address a truly existing problem in the United States. I mean, let me just give you one example. In California, there was a bill attempting to ban caste-based discrimination. That bill was proposed by California's first Muslim senator in collaboration with California's first Sikh representative. Okay, so a Sikh and a Muslim, it's almost like a joke. A Sikh and a Muslim went into a legislature, and what was their top legislative priority? Banning caste-based discrimination, when in fact, caste-based discrimination is already banned under California law. The effort was purely symbolic. The effort was there to try to identify Hindus with caste-based discrimination when there's no evidence that this exists in the United States.
So one is that your paper has found that there are only about 20 to 25,000 Americans who self-identify as Dalits. So that's a very small group of people. And even amongst these groups of people, a lot of them are graduates or postgraduates. So not only are the numbers not adding up, but also their social status is actually better than the average American. So you feel like this isn't activism actually for the quote unquote downtrodden. Then what is it?
There doesn't seem to be any broad-based Dalit activism in the United States to demand redress for discrimination against Dalits. In fact, as I said, there's virtually no evidence of discrimination against Dalits in the United States. Those Dalits who have made it to America are a self-selected tiny elite, mostly of doctors and high-level engineers and graduate students in the United States. That is, they're not people who faced a lot of discrimination in India. Instead, they're people who have been the most privileged among Indian Dalits. Now, that's not to say that Dalits don't face discrimination in India. It's to say that those Dalits who've made it to the United States, which is a tiny elite group, don't face large-scale discrimination in the United States. Yet their cause has been taken up by primarily Muslim American organizations and Sikh American organizations, the very organizations that are often associated with Kashmiri separatist activism in the United States and Khalistani separatist activism in the United States. They have taken up the cause, the supposed cause of American Dalits. It is an obvious attempt of an alliance of convenience meant to stigmatize American Hindus. And the whole culture war that's going on here in the Indian American diaspora has this flavor of people taking things that happen in India or happened in India generations ago, attempting to use those as evidence of discrimination in the United States, and then getting various American organizations to pass resolutions condemning it. When in fact, as I keep stating, no evidence has been presented that there's any actual caste-based discrimination in America.
Your paper is an interesting read from the sense that a lot of the numbers or the instances that are cited by these so-called organizations that are raising the issue of Dalit cause, and the prominent one and the one common link you found is equality labs that has been talked about and discussed quite a bit in India as well. Some of the figures that they're quoting, there is no basis for it. That some of the things that they're talking about, what would be the structure of their activism, actually has no research value or empirical value? Tell us a little bit more about what you found. What is this activism actually based on, if not, if the numbers are incorrect?
Equality Labs is an organization that seems to be run primarily by one person. It conducted a single survey in 2016, and that survey was sent out to a variety of Dalit and other activist organizations. That survey asked people, do you face discrimination in the United States, and came up with some outrageously high figures. Now, I say outrageously high because the figures don't really correspond to reality. For example, they said that 26% of Dalits in the United States had faced violence on account of their status as Dalits. And yet, in another place in the same document, they said only 25% of Dalits had faced either physical violence or verbal attacks. Well, those figures simply are not commensurate with each other. On top of that, the idea that more than half, something like 2/3 of Dalits are facing discrimination in the workplace seems at odds with the fact that 80% of the self-identified Dalits who answered the survey were themselves either postgraduate educated or postgraduate students. Now, it is possible for a highly educated person to face discrimination, but when we look for what kind of group needs protection from discrimination in a country, we're not usually looking at the most successful people in the country to ask if maybe they're facing some kind of discrimination. The whole survey was a very amateurish effort that had no basis in reality, in the sense that it wasn't based on a sample of self-identified Dalits. It was actually based on an activist self-reports. So the survey was distributed via what's called the snowball method, meaning I send it to my friends who send it to their friends who send it to their friends. It was not advertised in a broad way through mainstream Hindu civil society organizations or through Hindu temples or through mainstream Indian American organizations. It was distributed entirely through activist networks. I mean, it is a completely meaningless set of data produced by an organization that only has, it seems like, one primary officer. And yet this single survey done in 2016 has become the basis for the entire movement in the United States to associate caste-based discrimination with American Hindus.
You have, of course, mentioned that there have been a few instances that have come to light. One, of course, is the SB 403 legislation, or the bill that
Right.
was meant for California. Then there is the Cisco lawsuit, where it was
Right.
alleged that there was discrimination against Dalit executives or employees. And similarly,
But
in a couple of other
one Dalit executive, not even multiple, a single Dalit executive claimed that he did not receive as much of a promotion as he deserved, despite receiving a promotion, let's be clear, but he expected to receive a greater promotion than he got, and blamed this on discrimination against him as a Dalit.
Hmm. So there are these two, three things that have happened.
Yeah.
There's, of course, a similar move that took place in Seattle as well. How do you look at these movements? And there's been a common link of equality labs that you have found, and I urge our viewers to go and read your paper as well to understand more deeply. So, what do you make of this movement, particularly from the angle of these groups of Muslim and Sikh organizations, particularly those that have been known to pick up issues that generally in India would be looked as anti-India activism? What do you make of this entire movement, and how successful do you think they've been?
This is clearly a disingenuous movement, and I say that because this discrimination based on caste is already illegal under most U.S. civil rights legislation. In fact, Governor Newsom of California vetoed the California SB 403 for that precise reason, that it was a superfluous law. And the framers of the law knew that it was superfluous. In framing the law, they actually said in their very first draft, we recognize that discrimination based on caste is already prohibited. This new law is simply meant to provide additional information about caste. Now, not only that, but in Seattle, and then in a series of resolutions at universities across the country, at California State University, and then in a series of elite universities, mostly in the northeastern United States, there have been resolutions to ban caste-based discrimination. Again, to ban something that's already banned. Now, the resolutions themselves have long preambles in which they associate caste-based discrimination with the Hindu faith. They associate the caste-based discrimination with India. Some of them pro forma say that caste does exist in other South Asian countries. Some of them pro forma say that caste exists in other religions other than the Hindu faith. But fundamentally, the effort here is to associate in Americans' minds caste-based discrimination with the Hindu faith. And this association is then being reinforced through textbooks. There's a big effort in the United States to write textbook descriptions of India and of the Hindu faith to associate both of them with caste-based discrimination. And all of this centers on the activities of, as well, the Indian American Muslim Council and of other Muslim, Sikh, and connected with them Dalit rights activist organizations. It is viewed from above, viewed from the perspective of 10,000 feet. You clearly see that the purpose of this movement is not to improve conditions for people. Everyone's against caste-based discrimination, just like everyone's against race-based discrimination. Everyone's against sex-based discrimination. There's no quarrel there. The purpose of these efforts is to create in the American mind a connection between the Hindu faith and India and discrimination based on caste. Whether they succeed or don't succeed in getting these resolutions passed, the press coverage they're receiving creates that association in the American mind. And when Hindu associations in the United States, so organizations like the Hindu American Foundation, the Coalition of Hindus of North America, Hindu Pact, when they organize against these resolutions, of course, that then casts them in a negative light because it puts them in the awkward position of seeming to oppose reforms that would ban caste-based discrimination. Of course, what they're really opposing is the association of discriminatory behavior with the Hindu faith.
But have they been successful with via the coverage, etc., to kind of change the way Americans look at the Hindu faith or the Hindu community?
They've been very successful because, remember, most Americans don't give this issue much thought. If they ever read even one newspaper article about anything related to the Hindu faith, it's going to be one of these articles about effort at Harvard to ban caste-based discrimination, effort in California to ban caste-based discrimination, effort in Seattle, Microsoft, Cisco. They're attacking institutions that have high news value. They're not trying to prohibit caste-based discrimination at office cleaning companies or at security firms hiring nighttime security guards or in restaurants. They're trying to do this in high visibility organizations like Google, Cisco, Microsoft, Silicon Valley, Harvard University, Brown University, California State University, places where they'll get news coverage, and they'll get sympathetic news coverage from American journalists who generally know nothing about these issues. And the American journalists will interview both sides. But if all an American reads is one news article in a year that mentions Hindus, they're likely to have read an article in the past year that associates Hindus with caste-based discrimination.
Your key takeaways are that one, that the movement to ban so-called caste-based discrimination is sponsored mainly by Sikh, Muslim, and Dalit civil organizations. The best survey suggests that there are only about 25,000 Dalits in the US. And unlike Indian Dalits, where you're right, who have faced serious disadvantage, and therefore they are protected into scheduled castes and, for example, scheduled tribes that exist in India, American Dalits don't seem to be facing any real discrimination and actually do seem like a highly privileged population. And that Equality Labs, in its survey report, relied widely unrepresentative sample of self-selected Dalit rights activists, 80% of whom, as you have written, are either graduate students or holders of postgraduate degrees. And that this is the point that I was coming to. One of your other key takeaways is that anti-Hindu activism overlaps substantially with anti-Semitic activism
Yes.
in terms of both strategy and participating organizations. So elaborate a little bit on this, because what we are seeing in America today is also groups who are seemingly being anti-Semitic while they are being pro-Hamas as far as the Israel-Gaza war is concerned. So tell me a little bit more about why you feel that anti-Semitism and anti-Hinduism is overlapping? Because this is also something you had hinted at earlier in one of your papers,
Right.
that anti-Zionism is often used as a garb for anti-Semitism, just like anti-Hindutva is used as a
Right.
garb under which anti-Hindu activism prevails.
The organizations that are organizing against Hindus in the United States are largely the same organizations that are organizing against Jews in the United States, which is to say it's a combination of Islamist, and I stress not Muslim, Islamist organizations, combined in the case of India. Now, this is not the case for Israel, but in the case of India with Khalistani sympathetic organizations, combined with student human rights movements, with labor rights movements. And we see the same organizations signing on to letters that condemn caste-based discrimination. And then the same list of organizations will turn around and sign a letter condemning Israel and its position in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Literally the same groups of organizations. And often these organizations have nothing obvious to do with either movement. So, for example, in the United States, the Black Panthers, which is a Black nationalist movement dating back to the 1960s, Black Panther organizations have signed on to both Palestinian rights and to anti-caste open letters. Filipino revolutionary groups. Now, what does a Filipino revolutionary group have to do with the struggle for Dalit rights? I mean, seemingly nothing. And what does it have to do with the struggle for Palestine? Seemingly nothing. Yet those Filipino revolutionary groups signed both sets of letters. We see the same groups of organizations. Not only that, we see the same strategies. Okay, so the strategy used by both anti-Semitic and anti-Hindu organizations is to take an innocuous sounding claim. In the case of anti-Hindu activism, it's we're all opposed to discrimination based on caste. Now, everyone agrees with that. And so they go to organizations that really don't know much about this. Academic associations, they go to student groups especially, they go to labor unions who don't know anything about this. And they say, would you sign this letter condemning caste-based discrimination? And of course, these organizations say, yes, we condemn caste-based discrimination. They don't tell these organizations what their ultimate purpose is. They tell them we're looking to ban caste-based discrimination. Well, these same organizations then go to, again, the same group of associations and say, we'd like to condemn attacks on hospitals in Gaza. Well, again, they're not saying that we want you to support Hamas. They're not saying we want you to support they're just saying we want you to condemn attacks on hospitals. Well, we all condemn attacks on hospitals. And so again, these unsuspecting organizations sign on to these letters. Then you see a website pop up that has a list of 150 organizations that have condemned caste-based discrimination in the United States. And you know what? Of those 150 organizations, 120 are overlapping with the organizations that condemn the attacks on hospitals in Gaza, right? So it's the same organizations using the same tactics on the same unwitting collaborators who are just well-meaning people, unions, student groups, academic associations, who are just signing on to what they think is an obvious cause, not realizing that they're really just pawns in a larger game of which they have really no knowledge.
So basically, there is a political agenda behind this quote-unquote activism. It isn't really activism for the sake of activism.
There's certainly a political agenda. The idea that the idea that the Indian American Muslim Association cares so deeply about the plight of low caste Hindus that it makes it one of its major goals, one of its major campaigning goals to help low caste Hindus, simply beggars belief. It is not one of their major policy goals. It is something they see as a way to discredit people they see as their opponents. Now, I say people they see as their opponents because there's no corresponding activism on the Hindu side. The mainstream Hindu American organizations, and I've looked very closely at the work they've done, the Hindu American Foundation, the Coalition of Hindus in North America, Hindu Pact, they are not going after Muslims. They're not going after Muslim civil society organizations. They're not going after Sikh organizations. They're simply defending their ground and promoting their own religion and their own faith, as we would expect anyone to. This is really a one-sided battle where one side is shooting at the other, and the other side is taking cover, doing its best to defend itself. But it's not it's not a situation where both sides are just squabbling with each other. Now, unfortunately, most Americans are likely to see this as, Hindu and Muslim Indians just can't get along, and so they're squabbling. That's just not the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is the Indian American Muslim Council is actively seeking to discredit American Hindus, mendaciously so, by taking up an issue that appears sympathetic, when in reality, we have little to no evidence that there's any problem to be solved.
Our Indian viewers would obviously associate it also with the politics that goes on in India. For example, in India too, there are so-called Muslim groups and Dalit groups that do come together for their politics. We've seen certain Sikh groups and Dalit groups also come together for their politics. And I think what you're finding, for example, in the overseas community is a little bit of the same, what we have seen in Indian domestic politics as well, because caste is um, that's undercurrent that is exploited quite a bit as far as the Hindu community is concerned for politics in India. And there are various groups that come together, at the corners of intersectionality, as you may call it, to kind of make truck with each other for those causes against what you said seemingly is their larger enemy, which in this case we believe is very, very much the Hindu American community. And in India, there is a parallel to this as well. But I do want to understand from you, how do you see the future of this movement? With this SB 403 bill being vetoed by the governor, with the Cisco lawsuit also falling at least on one measure,
Right.
while part of the case is continuing. Um, maybe some of the organizations on ground in America are also becoming more active in kind of in kind of cutting the message that these organizations are bringing to the fore, and they're becoming more vocal. What do you think is the future of this movement, and how far can it go?
Hindu civil society groups in the United States are winning the battles but losing the war. And I say that because although they can win these particular legal battles because the legal merits are on their side, they're losing the larger information war because they don't seem to realize that the purpose of the Muslim civil society organizations and the Sikh civil society organizations, their purpose is not actually to ban caste-based discrimination. Their purpose is to associate caste-based discrimination with the Hindu religion in the American mind. So even if these various initiatives are defeated, they nonetheless leave the impression among Americans, and I must say, especially among credulous American journalists, they leave the impression that the Muslim and Sikh and Dalit civil society organizations are fighting the noble fight to do good in the world, and they're being stymied by Hindu civil society organizations that are resisting positive reforms. I think that's the general impression that's being created. And that false impression is precisely what these anti-Hindu organizations want to do. They don't actually want to get any particular law passed. As I said, even if they succeed in passing the law, that's irrelevant because caste-based discrimination is already illegal. It has no practical impact. The laws themselves even say in their preambles, this will not change law. It simply exists to be declaratory of the law. That is, it simply declares a series of supposed findings. So the goal here, unfortunately, the anti-Hindu organizations are succeeding in their goal, even if they're losing in the actual battles over legislation and the battles over court cases. It's an irony, but it's simply true.
My final question to you, Salvatore Babones. In India, a lot of discussion has taken place about how the Hindu community is much vilified for no fault of its own. Maybe purely because it is the larger or the majority religion in India, and it's always been either vilified or been asked to kind of cut itself a little bit, purely because the numbers are higher. And there's a lot of activism, but there's a lot of politics that kind of plays on that as well, the Hindu religion and the Hindu identity. We're seeing a little bit of that happen in countries like Australia, in countries like UK,
Right.
in countries like America. Why do you feel, as an observer of the politics both in India and overseas, why do you feel the Hindu community gets attacked so much? What is it about it that irks groups, and what is it that they want to do? Why is it that they would have this agenda against Hindu Americans, for example?
I think the mechanisms are very different in India and abroad, and that may be very difficult for Hindus to see because they may feel they're being attacked in both places, and so it must be for the same reasons. In India, let's say the internal politics in India is really all about Indian politics, and it's all about playing politics within India, getting advantage within politics within India, and that's within the country. Overseas, the reason that Hindus are being vilified is that the rest of the world does not see India as a multi-religious country. The rest of the world sees India, practically speaking, as a Hindu country. Now, I know that that's something that in India is highly controversial. I realize that India has a secular constitution and a secular state. I'm aware of all, and Indians are aware of all this within India. But for everyone else in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in Australia, India and Hindu are the same thing. Now, that shouldn't be the case. That is the case. Let's just be frank about it. And so Hindus abroad are facing attacks, not because American Muslims dislike American Hindus, not because American Muslims are seeking advantage over American Hindus in American politics. American Hindus abroad, American Hindus and Australian Hindus and British Hindus are facing attacks because the international Islamists and the international Khalistanis associate Hindus with India, and they know that Americans, British people, Australians all associate Hindus with India. In other words, the Hindu organizations and the Hindu civil society in America is being attacked as a proxy for India. Now, that's not right. That's not appropriate. That's not what it should be. India is a secular state. Nonetheless, when Hindus become vilified in the United States, implicitly, India becomes vilified in the United States. And the goal of these organizations is not primarily to harm their own Hindu neighbors in the United States. The goal of these organizations is to harm America-India relations, to harm Australia-India relations, to harm UK-India relations. And that's something for Hindus in India really have to understand that their politics don't necessarily apply in the diaspora, just as people in the diaspora have to realize that their politics don't necessarily apply in India.
Well, that's an interesting take. It is all a proxy war against India, and also an India that is rising as far as its global stature is concerned. And many believe these attacks have also increased because of, quote unquote, a Hindu nationalist party in the BJP being in power and being as strong as it is over the last 10 years or so. Am I correct?
I think it's easy to make that association, but I really want to remind Indians that if in the next election the INDIA coalition were to take power in 2024, all of these problems would be inherited by that coalition. Yes, it's easier to associate. It's easier to associate Narendra Modi with the Hindu religion than it is to associate Rahul Gandhi with the Hindu religion. But the association is still there. India was being vilified for its repression of religious minorities before 2014. The very first international religious freedom rankings already rated India in the bottom 10 in the world, and that was in 2009. Okay, so that was under a Congress government. The same vilification of Hindus and Indians will occur. Hindus and Indians will occur even if there's a change in government. So while in one sense, it's very easy to say, oh, it's all about discrediting Mr. Modi or the BJP, I really have to warn Indians, and especially here, I want to talk to the 50% of Indians who do not support the BJP. I'd like to remind them that this is a problem for India, not a problem for the BJP.
All right. So a proxy war against India, really, and India's rise. Salvatore Babones, thanks a lot for speaking to us.